Sometimes the person everyone ignores is the one somebody else has spent years searching for. The first sound that broke the quiet elegance of the restaurant was not a ringing phone or a dropped glass. It was the sharp clatter of a fork hitting a porcelain plate. Heads turned immediately. Conversations paused. Several diners looked toward the private dining section near the center of the room. 12-year-old Mason Collins had frozen in his chair. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the restaurant. His mother followed his gaze. At first, Audrey Collins saw nothing unusual. The billionaire businesswoman had spent years attending charity galas, executive dinners, and private events where every face seemed important. But this face was different. Not because it belonged to a celebrity. Not because it belonged to a politician. It belonged to a man sitting quietly beside a teenage girl near the window. The man wore a simple navy jacket. His dark brown hair showed signs of a long workday. Nothing about him demanded attention. In fact, most people in the restaurant had barely noticed he was there. "Mom," Mason whispered. Then he stood up so quickly that his chair nearly tipped backward. "Mom, that is him." Audrey stared at her son. The expression on his face instantly erased every doubt. She had seen that look before. Only once. Years ago. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Mason never took his eyes off the man. "I know it is him." For a moment, Audrey said nothing. Around them, wealthy investors and business partners continued their conversations, unaware that something unusual had just happened. Soft piano music drifted through the restaurant. Crystal glasses reflected warm golden light. Outside the large windows, Nashville glowed beneath the evening sky. Yet Audrey felt as though the entire room had suddenly disappeared. 6 years. 6 long years. Her son had mentioned one person more than anyone else outside their family. A stranger. A man whose name they never knew. A man they had never been able to find. And now that same man was sitting less than 50 feet away. Across the restaurant, Logan Parker had no idea he was being watched. He sat comfortably beside his 14-year-old daughter, Olivia. Their table was small. Their meal was simple compared to many others in the restaurant. Logan smiled while listening to Olivia describe a school project she had spent weeks preparing. "I think it is going to work," she said excitedly. "You always say that right before you do something amazing," Logan replied. Olivia laughed. The sound was genuine and warm. Logan enjoyed moments like these more than anything money could buy. Life had not been easy since becoming a single father. There had been difficult years. Long workdays. Tight budgets. Sacrifices nobody ever saw. But evenings with Olivia reminded him why every struggle mattered. Neither of them noticed Mason standing across the room. Neither of them noticed Audrey slowly lowering her menu. Neither of them noticed that several people at the billionaire's table were beginning to ask questions. "Who is that?" one executive asked. Audrey did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Logan. A memory had already begun returning. A rainy afternoon. A frightened boy. A stranger who stopped when nobody else did. Mason swallowed hard. "Mom," he said again. "He is the one." And for the second time that evening, Audrey Collins felt her entire world shift in a direction she never expected. While Mason remained standing beside the table, Logan Parker continued his conversation completely unaware that his quiet evening had become the center of someone else's attention. Olivia leaned forward, excitedly explaining the final details of her school presentation. "I still think I am going to be nervous," she admitted. Logan smiled. "Everybody gets nervous before something important. Even you. Especially me." Olivia laughed. "You do not seem nervous about anything." Logan shook his head. "That is because I learned a secret." "What secret?" "Most people are nervous. Some are just better at hiding it." Olivia rolled her eyes playfully. "That sounds like a dad answer." "It is a dad answer." Their laughter blended softly with the piano music drifting through the restaurant. For a moment, the pressures waiting outside seemed far away. The overdue maintenance on Logan's truck. The extra shifts he had picked up. The careful budgeting required every month. None of it mattered while he sat across from his daughter. Across the room, Audrey Collins continued watching. She noticed the way Logan listened whenever Olivia spoke. She noticed how he never looked at his phone. She noticed how every response carried patience and genuine attention. It reminded her of something Mason had once described years ago. The memory stirred again. "He talked to me like I mattered," Mason had told her. At the time, she thought her son was simply grateful. But over the years, he never stopped mentioning that day. Children forget many things. They forget birthdays. They forget names. They forget promises. Yet somehow Mason never forgot a stranger. Mom, Mason said quietly. Audrey looked up. Yes, it is definitely him. Audrey nodded slowly. She no longer doubted it. Meanwhile, Logan glanced around the restaurant for the first time that evening. The place was far nicer than where they usually ate. Olivia had earned a major academic award that week, and after months of saving, Logan wanted to celebrate properly. The dinner was not extravagant. It was simply special. Thank you for tonight, Olivia said suddenly. Logan looked surprised. For what? For all of it. All of what? Everything. The answer caught him off guard. Olivia smiled softly. You always make things work. Logan looked down for a moment. Parents rarely hear the things they need most. Sometimes children notice sacrifices that adults assume go unseen. I try, he said quietly. I know. The word stayed with him. Around them, servers moved between tables carrying elegant meals. Business executives discussed investments. Couples celebrated anniversaries. The restaurant glowed with warm light and polished luxury. Yet the most meaningful conversation in the room was happening at the smallest table near the window. Back at the VIP section, several guests had begun asking Audrey questions. Do you know him? One investor asked. Who is he? Asked another. Audrey simply smiled. Someone important. The answer only deepened their curiosity. Important people usually arrived with introductions, titles, and recognition. Logan had none of those things. He looked like an ordinary man finishing dinner with his daughter after a long week. That was precisely what made the situation so confusing. Mason finally sat down again, but his eyes never left Logan. 6 years earlier, he had been frightened, alone, and overwhelmed. One stranger had changed that. One stranger had stopped when everyone else kept walking. And now that same stranger sat less than 50 feet away, completely unaware that the quiet kindness he barely remembered was about to return to him in a way he never could have imagined. At most restaurants, the most important table is the one everyone can see. That night, the most important table was the one nobody noticed. Audrey Collins had spent most of her adult life becoming the kind of person people recognized instantly. Her name appeared in business magazines. Her company employed thousands of people across the country. Investors followed her decisions. Reporters requested interviews. Yet none of that attention had ever impressed her son. Mason had always measured people differently. He remembered kindness. He remembered honesty. He remembered how people treated others when there was nothing to gain. Audrey glanced around the private dining area where several executives waited for the discussion to continue. Crystal glasses rested beside expensive meals. Conversations about acquisitions, expansion plans, and quarterly forecasts filled the air. Normally, Audrey would have been leading those conversations. Tonight, however, her attention remained fixed on the small table near the window. You are very quiet, one executive observed. Audrey smiled politely. Just thinking. About the proposal? Another asked. Not exactly. The men exchanged confused looks. They were accustomed to having her complete attention. Across from Audrey, Mason sat perfectly still. He had barely touched his dinner since spotting Logan. Every few moments, he glanced toward the corner of the restaurant as if afraid the man might disappear. Audrey understood that feeling. For years, she had listened to her son tell the same story. The details never changed. A rainy afternoon, a crowded station, fear, confusion, then one stranger stopping to help. What always fascinated her was not the event itself. It was the impact. 6 years had passed. Mason still spoke about it. Most people forget moments like that, Audrey once told him. Mason had shaken his head. Not that moment. Why? Because he did not have to stop. The answer had stayed with her ever since. Now she watched Logan laughing with Olivia. The scene looked ordinary. Beautifully ordinary. There was no performance. No attempt to impress anyone. No awareness that one of the wealthiest women in Tennessee was watching from across the room. Logan listened while Olivia talked about school. He asked questions. He paid attention. Audrey noticed something many successful people often missed. Presence. Logan was fully present. His daughter had his complete focus. The realization brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. Money could solve many problems. It could not purchase genuine attention. Mom, Mason said softly. Do you think he remembers me? Audrey considered the question. I do not know. Mason looked down. I remember him. Audrey reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I know. For several seconds neither spoke. The piano player began a slower melody. Soft light reflected from the restaurant windows. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the evening sky. Inside, something much more important than business was unfolding. One executive finally followed Audrey's gaze toward Logan's table. "Who exactly is that man?" he asked. Audrey looked at him calmly. Then she looked back at Logan. The answer felt surprisingly simple. "Someone my son never forgot." The executive frowned, clearly expecting more explanation. None came, because at that moment Audrey realized something remarkable. Everyone in the restaurant knew who she was. Yet the man sitting by the window had changed a child's life without ever asking for recognition. And somehow that made him more impressive than anyone else in the room. The moment arrived so quietly that most people did not realize it was happening. Audrey Collins set down her glass of water. Mason immediately looked up. Several executives paused in the middle of a discussion. The movement was subtle, but when one of the most recognizable business leaders in the state stood from her seat, people noticed. Conversation slowed. A server stopped briefly beside a nearby table. Audrey adjusted the sleeve of her white jacket and looked across the restaurant one more time. Logan Parker was still talking with Olivia. He remained completely unaware that half the room had begun watching him. "Mom?" Mason asked. Audrey smiled. "I think it is time." The boy's eyes brightened instantly. At the VIP table, confusion spread among the guests. "You are leaving?" one investor asked. "For a moment," Audrey replied. "There is someone I need to speak with." "A client," another guest. Audrey shook her head. "No." The answer only deepened the mystery. Slowly, she stepped away from the table. Mason followed. The two of them began walking across the restaurant floor together. Soft piano music continued playing, but the atmosphere had changed. Heads turned. Conversations faded. People watched without understanding why. Some assumed Audrey recognized an important business contact. Others assumed she was greeting a celebrity. No one considered the possibility that her destination was the small corner table occupied by a single father and his daughter. Logan noticed the attention before he noticed its cause. Olivia glanced toward the center of the room. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think people are staring." Logan looked around. Sure enough, dozens of eyes seemed focused in one direction. He followed their gaze and immediately saw Audrey Collins walking toward them. For a brief moment, he wondered whether she was headed somewhere nearby. Then she continued moving straight toward his table. Logan blinked. "That is strange." Olivia looked equally confused. "Do you know her?" "No, are you sure?" "Very sure." Audrey continued walking. Every step seemed to increase the silence around her. Nearby diners watched openly now. Several people even turned in their chairs. At the VIP table, executives exchanged puzzled looks. One of them quietly whispered, "What is happening?" Nobody had an answer. Logan sat a little straighter. Years of working hard and staying out of the spotlight had not prepared him for moments like this. He searched his memory, but found nothing. He had never met Audrey Collins. He was certain of that. Yet the expression on her face suggested something entirely different. It was not the look of someone approaching a stranger. It was the look of someone finally reaching a destination after a very long search. Beside her, Mason looked increasingly emotional. His eyes never left Logan. Olivia noticed it too. "Dad," she whispered. "That boy knows you." Logan looked at Mason. The feeling was strange. Familiarity lingered somewhere beyond reach, like a memory hidden behind fog. Audrey finally stopped beside the table. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Logan looked up politely. Olivia sat quietly beside him. Mason stood next to his mother. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Audrey smiled. Not the polished smile that appeared in magazines. Not the professional smile used during interviews. This smile was personal, genuine, grateful. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Would you mind if we joined you for a moment?" And for the first time that evening, Logan Parker realized that whatever was happening had absolutely nothing to do with business. For a moment, Logan Parker simply stared at the woman standing beside his table. Around them, the restaurant remained unusually quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that people were clearly paying attention. Logan glanced at Olivia, then back at Audrey Collins. "Of course," he said politely. "Please." Audrey thanked him and took the empty chair closest to the table. Mason sat beside her without hesitation. The boy's eyes never left Logan. It was not the look of someone meeting a stranger. It was the look of someone finally seeing a person who had lived in his memory for years. Logan felt increasingly confused. Have we met before? He asked. Audrey exchanged a brief glance with Mason. That is what we were hoping to ask you. Logan smiled awkwardly. I am afraid I do not understand. Olivia leaned forward slightly, curious but respectful. Mason finally spoke. Do you ever go through life helping people and then forgetting about it? Logan laughed softly. More often than you would think. Mason nodded as though he had expected that answer. That sounds like you. Audrey watched the exchange carefully. Every word seemed to confirm what she already believed. Logan was exactly the person her son had described all those years ago. Not dramatic, not self-important, just kind. Mr. Parker, Audrey said gently. Does the name Mason Collins mean anything to you? Logan studied the boy's face. The question stirred something deep in his memory. Not a clear memory, more like a distant echo. He looked at Mason again. Brown hair, honest eyes, a familiar expression. Yet he still could not place him. I wish I could say yes, Logan admitted. But I cannot. There was no disappointment in Mason's reaction. In fact, he smiled. I told you he would not remember. Audrey laughed quietly. You did. Logan looked from one to the other. Now I am even more confused. Several nearby diners pretended not to watch, though their attention remained fixed on the table. Even the servers seemed unusually interested in passing through that section of the restaurant. Something important was clearly happening, though nobody yet understood what. Audrey folded her hands together. 6 years ago, she began, my son experienced one of the worst afternoons of his life. Logan listened. Mason lowered his eyes briefly. I was scared, the boy admitted. Really scared. The words landed with surprising weight. Logan felt the faintest pull of recognition. Not enough to form a memory, but enough to make him listen more carefully. Audrey continued. For years, Mason has told me about one person from that day. Logan remained silent. One person who stopped when nobody else did. Olivia glanced at her father. Logan looked thoughtful now. The restaurant around them seemed to fade away. The piano music, the conversations, the clinking glasses. None of it mattered anymore. Audrey's voice softened. We spent years wondering who that person was. Mason smiled. And now we know. Logan leaned back slightly. He still could not remember the event itself, but something about the boy's sincerity felt impossible to ignore. Then Mason said 7 simple words that instantly changed the expression on Logan's face. It was raining at the bus station. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, a forgotten memory began finding its way back. The words hit Logan Parker like a distant bell ringing through years of forgotten memories. Rain. A bus station. A frightened boy. Suddenly pieces began returning. Not all at once, but slowly enough to make him lean forward. Wait, he said quietly. Mason nodded immediately. You remember something. Logan rubbed his forehead. I remember a storm. The restaurant seemed to disappear around them. Audrey Collins listened carefully while Olivia watched her father with growing curiosity. Logan looked toward the window as if the memory were hidden somewhere beyond the glass. It was late afternoon, he said. The weather was terrible. I had just finished a job across town. Mason smiled. Yes. Logan continued. The station was crowded because several routes were delayed. More details surfaced. The sound of rain striking the roof. People rushing past each other. Travelers pulling suitcases through puddles. There was a boy sitting alone near a vending machine. Mason's eyes immediately filled with emotion. That was me. Logan finally remembered. The boy had looked terrified. Not injured. Not in danger. Just completely overwhelmed. You kept looking at the entrance, Logan said. Like you were expecting someone to walk through the door. Mason nodded. I was trying not to cry. Audrey lowered her eyes briefly. Even after 6 years, hearing those words still hurt. Logan took a slow breath. I asked if you were okay. Mason laughed softly. And I lied. Olivia looked confused. What happened? Mason turned toward her. I told your dad I was fine. Logan smiled. You were not convincing. The memory became clearer with every second. Logan remembered buying a bottle of water from a machine. He remembered sitting nearby rather than standing over the boy. He remembered speaking calmly because frightened children rarely responded well to panic. You told me your phone battery had died, Logan said. And you could not reach your mother. Audrey looked surprised. You remember that? Now I do. Logan smiled faintly. At first I only remembered the rain. Mason shook his head in disbelief. I cannot believe you actually remember. Logan looked at him kindly. I remember enough. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Olivia asked the obvious question. What happened next? Mason answered before anyone else could. Your dad stayed. The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Logan remembered that too. He had nowhere important to be. No urgent meeting. No reward waiting. He had simply looked at a scared child and decided not to walk away. A lot of people passed by, Mason said quietly. Nobody stopped. Logan shrugged. Most people probably thought someone else was helping. Audrey watched him carefully. There it was again. The same humility her son had described for years. No pride. No attempt to make himself look noble. Just a simple explanation. Mason smiled. You stayed nearly an hour. Logan blinked. Was it that long? 47 minutes, Mason replied. Olivia laughed. You counted. I remembered everything. The answer filled the table with gentle silence. Some moments become permanent in a person's life not because they are extraordinary, but because they happen exactly when they are needed. Logan was beginning to understand that what he considered an ordinary afternoon had become something very different in the memory of a 12-year-old boy. And Audrey Collins had not crossed the restaurant because of a business deal or a favor. She had crossed the room because 6 years earlier, when her son felt alone in a crowded world, one stranger had quietly chosen to stay. Logan sat quietly as the memory settled into place, but Mason was not finished. The boy had waited 6 years for this conversation, and now that it had finally begun, every detail seemed to matter. There is something else you probably do not remember, Mason said. Logan smiled. Based on tonight, there are probably a lot of things I do not remember. Olivia laughed softly while Audrey watched her son with affectionate curiosity. She had heard this story many times, yet she still wanted to hear it again. Mason leaned forward. You kept talking to me even after I stopped answering. Logan looked surprised. I did. Yes. Mason nodded. At first I was too scared to say much. Slowly, more fragments returned to Logan's mind. The frightened boy had been staring at the floor. His hands had been shaking slightly. Every few minutes he had glanced toward the entrance, hoping to see a familiar face. I remember trying to distract you, Logan said. You did more than that, Mason replied. You asked me about school. You asked me what I wanted to be someday. Logan laughed quietly. That sounds like something I would do. Then you told me about Olivia. The teenage girl blinked. Me? Mason smiled. You were 8 years old then. Olivia looked at her father. You talked about me? Apparently I did. Mason nodded enthusiastically. You told me your daughter was brave. You said brave people are not the ones who never get scared. Brave people are the ones who keep going anyway. The words hung in the air for a moment. Logan had completely forgotten saying them. Yet hearing them now felt strangely familiar. Olivia smiled. That definitely sounds like you. Audrey noticed the expression on Logan's face. He was not remembering facts anymore. He was remembering feelings. The concern he had felt for a frightened child. The simple desire to help. The instinct to stay. Do you know what I remembered most? Mason asked. Logan shook his head. What? The boy's answer came immediately. You treated me like I mattered. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Around them, the restaurant continued operating, but the noise seemed distant now. Some nearby diners still watched discreetly, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding. Mason took a slow breath. Most adults kept walking. They were busy. I understand that now. But when you sat down beside me, it felt like the entire world slowed down. Logan lowered his eyes. He was not accustomed to hearing his actions described that way. To him, the afternoon at the station had been ordinary. To Mason, it had become unforgettable. You told me everything would be okay, Mason continued. And somehow I believed you. Audrey felt emotion rise in her chest. She remembered the relief she had felt when she finally reached her son that day. She also remembered what happened afterward. For weeks, Mason talked about the stranger who had stayed with him. For months, he mentioned him. Then years passed, and he still remembered. Mom thought I would eventually forget, Mason said with a grin. Audrey laughed. I admit it. I did. But I never did. Mason looked directly at Logan. Because that day taught me something important. Logan tilted his head slightly. What was that? The boy smiled. That good people still exist. And as those words settled over the table, Logan realized that the greatest impact a person can have is often the one they never know they made. Audrey Collins looked at Logan for a long moment after Mason finished speaking. The expression on her face carried something deeper than gratitude. It carried relief. 6 years of wondering had finally come to an end. Logan shifted slightly in his chair, still uncomfortable being the center of attention. I appreciate what you are saying, he told Mason. But honestly, I did not do anything extraordinary. Mason immediately smiled. That is exactly what I told Mom you would say. Audrey laughed softly. He did. Logan shook his head. I am serious. Audrey leaned forward. And that is why we spent so many years trying to find you. Logan looked genuinely puzzled. Find me? Yes. Audrey glanced around briefly before returning her attention to him. For a long time, I only knew a few details. Mason remembered that your name was Logan. He remembered that you had a daughter named Olivia. He remembered that you worked with your hands because your work boots were covered in dust. Olivia looked surprised. He remembered all that? Mason nodded proudly. Every bit of it. Audrey continued. We tried searching. Not obsessively. But every now and then, we would look. We hoped someday we might have the chance to thank you properly. Logan looked down, almost embarrassed by the attention. There is no need for that. There absolutely is, Audrey replied gently. The sincerity in her voice silenced any protest he might have made. For years, Audrey had watched her son grow into a thoughtful young man. Whenever conversations turned toward success, leadership, or character, Mason always returned to the same story. Not because of the fear he had experienced that afternoon, because of the kindness he had experienced afterward. Do you know something? Audrey asked. Logan shook his head. What? Every year on the anniversary of that day, Mason would bring you up. Logan blinked. Every year. Every single year. Mason laughed. That is true. Audrey smiled. When he was younger, he would ask if we would ever see you again. When he got older, he stopped asking. But he never stopped remembering. Logan sat quietly. Across the table, Olivia could see the emotion building behind her father's calm expression. He had spent most of his life believing that small acts disappeared into the past. Tonight, he was learning that some acts stayed alive in places he never imagined. You know what impressed me most? Audrey asked. Logan looked up. What? It was not that you stayed. Logan seemed surprised by the answer. Audrey continued. It was why you stayed. The restaurant around them felt quieter than ever. Several nearby diners had completely stopped pretending not to listen. Audrey's voice remained calm and warm. You did not know who Mason was. You did not know who I was. You did not know whether helping would benefit you in any way. Logan nodded slowly. That is true. You stayed anyway. Audrey smiled. That told me everything I needed to know about your character. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mason grinned. I told Mom that good people do not need an audience. Logan laughed softly. That is a pretty wise thing for a 12-year-old to say. I learned it from you. The answer landed gently but powerfully. Logan looked at the boy, then at Olivia, then at Audrey. He still did not see himself as extraordinary. Yet for the first time, he was beginning to understand why Audrey Collins had crossed an entire restaurant to reach his table. It was not because of what he had done. It was because of what that simple act of kindness had meant long after the moment itself had ended. For several seconds after Mason finished speaking, nobody at the table said a word. Sometimes the most important moments arrive without applause. They arrive in silence. Logan Parker looked around the table and saw something he had never expected to see. Gratitude that had survived 6 years. Respect that had grown stronger with time. Audrey Collins smiled warmly. There is one more thing I want you to know. Logan listened quietly. Audrey glanced at her son before continuing. You changed more than one afternoon. Logan immediately shook his head. I think you are giving me too much credit. Mason laughed. See? I told you he would say that too. Olivia smiled beside her father. The evening had become something none of them could have predicted. Audrey folded her hands together. After that day, Mason became different. Logan looked surprised. Different how? Mason answered before his mother could. I started paying attention. To what? Logan asked. To people. The answer was simple, but its meaning ran deep. I noticed when someone was sitting alone, Mason said. I noticed when somebody looked nervous. I noticed when somebody needed help. Audrey nodded. Because one person showed him that small acts matter. Logan looked down for a moment. His eyes reflected the kind of humility that comes from never expecting recognition. I honestly do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything, Audrey replied gently. You already did the important part 6 years ago. Nearby tables had grown unusually quiet. People were no longer pretending not to listen. They had heard enough to understand what was happening. The billionaire who could have sat with anyone in the room had chosen to spend her evening thanking a single father. Not because he was famous, not because he was wealthy, because he had been kind. Mason smiled at Logan. Do you know something funny? Logan shook his head. What? For years, I imagined what this meeting would be like. Logan laughed softly. And it is better than I imagined. Olivia grinned. That is a lot of pressure for my dad. Everyone laughed. The tension that had filled the restaurant earlier had completely disappeared. In its place was something warmer, something genuine. Audrey slowly stood from her chair. Mason stood beside her. Logan and Olivia followed. For a moment, the four of them simply looked at one another. Different backgrounds, different lives, different worlds, yet all connected by a single decision made on a rainy afternoon years earlier. Audrey extended her hand. Logan shook it. Thank you, she said quietly. Not for helping my son find me that day. Thank you for showing him what character looks like. Logan swallowed hard. I was just doing what anybody should do. Audrey smiled. The truth is, not everybody does. The words settled gently over the table. Around them, the restaurant had become remarkably still. Some people lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Many were thinking the same thing. The man sitting at the smallest table had never tried to impress anyone. Yet somehow he had become the person everyone respected most. Mason looked at Logan one last time. I never forgot. Logan smiled. I am glad you are doing well. I am, Mason said. And part of that is because of you. No one rushed to speak after that. No one felt the need to fill the silence. Because sometimes the greatest reward for a good deed is not money, recognition, or praise. Sometimes it is discovering that a moment you barely remembered became a lesson someone else carried for a lifetime. And as the restaurant settled into a quiet that felt almost sacred, the people watching finally understood something important. Kindness does not become valuable because somebody notices it. Kindness is valuable because it changes lives even when nobody is watching.